Okay, so we are looking at C1, species and communities, but we're going to be focusing on some species interactions, so interactions between different species. We looked at those interactions last class, so we've got competition, herbivory, predation, parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism. But we're going to take a deep dive into competition. And to understand competition, we're going to need to dig into the term niche and some categories of the term niche. And we're going to be looking at something called competitive exclusion and resource partitioning. So we're going to see, okay, how does a species end up, what type of niche does it end up occupying if there is another species there that it is competing with? So let's dig into some of these terms. All right, so I'm taking you back to competition. All right, so competition can be intraspecific, so it can be between members of the same species, and it can also be interspecific. So when you've got a bunch of different species competing for the same resource. Now we know that in competition that we learned last time, the competitors both are at a loss. Like one doesn't benefit, both essentially are harmed or inhibited by their interaction. Even if this hyena here is getting the food, getting that carcass, it still has to expend energy defending it, which it wouldn't have had to if there was nothing to compete against. So both the winner and the loser ends up being inhibited in some sort of way. I'm going to be digging into some terms called competitive exclusion and resource partitioning. And essentially, when you have species, two different species that are competing for resource, one might outcompete the other with competitive exclusion. That's going to be really common with invasive species. When we see species that have moved into a new habitat, like the cane toad or the Spanish slug, they tend to outcompete the native species that are there and eliminate them almost altogether. And that's competitive exclusion. But sometimes you can have competition where some of them might be excluded. Some species might be excluded from one area, but they've all kind of managed to occupy a little bit different area within that habitat. And that is when we start looking at something called resource partitioning. I'll show you some examples. Okay, so the term ecological niche, you need to know this. It's the functional position or role of an organism in its environment. Now, it doesn't stop there. There's more to the definition because it comprises of, yes, the habitat where it lives, but it also is its activity patterns. When is it out? Is it out during the day? Is it nocturnal? What are the resources that it needs from and exploits within its habitat? And also, what are its interactions with other species? So a niche is a really all-encompassing term. It includes a lot of things, and there's a lot of depth to it, whereas habitat is simply where an organism lives. Okay, now there's two kind of sub-definitions. There's fundamental niche and realized niche. And the fundamental niche is the potential mode of existence of a species based on its adaptation and essentially from like all the things that could have it's a whole zone of tolerance kind of from the other things we're looking at. So it can occupy all those areas. So this is an example of the Chalamus barnacle. And this barnacle could exist all the way from low tide to high tide regions on a rock in an intertidal zone. And this is if it's all by itself, there's nothing competing with it, and it is capable of living from here to here to be able to exploit all those resources. Now, if you bring in a little bit of competition, the Balanus barnacle, then you see that the Chalamus barnacle is going to be a little bit higher up near the high tide. It's been excluded from the lower zones because of the competition with the Balanus. And so what's going on here is we're getting a little bit of resource partitioning between the two species because they're existing together. One thing that is kind of nice to look at, we've looked at these kind of zones of tolerance or these areas. This curve, rather than being a zone of tolerance, this curve is just kind of representing the fundamental niche, the larger curve. So what happens to, the niche? Where does the realized niche fit in based on different types of competition? And so if you get competition that is interspecific, right? So between two different species, that's when we start to see we're shrinking into that, like with the Chalamus barnacles, into a realized niche, okay? If you have very intense competition, interspecific, you can see it smooshes it up into an even smaller niche. But one thing that's interesting is when you get intraspecific, so between the same species, the niches actually tend to broaden. And that's kind of when we see that adaptive radiation type thing with the finches on the island starting to exploit more and more resources so they aren't competing with each other for that one individual one. Okay. The idea of the competitive exclusion principle, essentially what that is that two species, if they're competing for the same limiting resources, they can't exist in the same place. The competition is going to be just way too high. And this was studied pretty heavily by Gauss, and he looked into paramecium, two different species of Caudatum and Aurelia. And you can see when they're raised, this top one is showing, oh, we were raising them separately in the lab. So these are in like two different beakers, right? And they both thrive when they're all by themselves. But when you put them and raise them in the same environment, in the same beaker, well, P. aurelia does much better than the P. caudatum. They both don't do quite as well, but definitely the caudatum doesn't do very well at all in comparison. So this aurelia is outcompeting it. Here is a pretty cool example about competitive exclusion in cattails. So I want you to take a look at this. And you're looking at two species of wetland plants. And the plants are cattails. There's the latifolia and angustifolia. And we've got negative depth means it's out of the water. And the upper graph shows situations where both species are in a natural habitat together. Okay. And then the lower graph shows their distributions where they are grown separately. So here is when they're both grown all by themselves. So you can see this would be the fundamental niche of both of them. Okay. So what would then the distribution be when they're grown together versus separately? How does that change? All right, I want you to pause and think about that for a minute. How can you compare? And I want you to use the terms fundamental and realized niche. Okay, if you've come back. So here is our fundamental niche, especially for angustifolia. But when you raise the angustifolia with the other species, with the latifolia, notice how much its niche starts to narrow, and it's starting to specialize more in the greater depths. Whereas the latifolia seems to do pretty well. It's a little bit inhibited in comparison to what it was before, but it seems to do pretty well in the out of depth, like the negative ones that make it out of the water. And so you can see this one's doing just fine, but with competition, this one gets relegated to its realized niche. Okay, here's an example of resource partitioning, and that's kind of what was happening with those two species there. But resource partitioning is when you get the differentiation of niches so that you can get similar species that can coexist in a community. And this is showing some anoles lizards that live in the Caribbean. And there's a whole bunch of different similar species, but they tend to specialize in the different places, in the trees, on the fences, on the ground. And so they do their hunting and a lot of their existing in different places, so they aren't actually like head-on competing with each other. Another example of resource partitioning in warblers. So we've got the yellow rumped warbler and the bay-breasted warbler. When they're found foraging together on a tree, they tend to actually divide up the tree. They have similar prey, but they tend to divide up the tree into different places, so they're not actively competing with each other. So if they were alone, they probably wouldn't have to do this. Like the yellow rumped would be found all over here, and the bay-breasted would probably be found all over here. But you can see that when they're together, there's some competitive exclusion happening down here for the bay-breasted warbler, and it starts to move up towards the higher branches. So it's really important that you're able to talk about fundamental and realized niche. You know, the fundamental niche is kind of where it would exist. The realized niche, if there's competition, then it's going to be pushed into its realized niche. Okay, and that is going to happen because of competitive exclusion in the zone where it's no longer found. But it can also be a bit of resource partitioning where species tend to move to areas where they're not actively competing with each other.